Is that really what we are?
No.
She did not look at me when she asked it. That was the part I kept coming back to afterward. In the days and then weeks of turning the evening over the way you turn a mechanism in your hands when you're trying to understand how it failed. She was looking straight ahead at the screen, her hands folded in her lap, and she set it into the middle distance the way you say something that has been ready for a long time and finally just needed to be released into the air between two people. Is that really what we are? I had the watch in my coat pocket. I always have the watch. My hand found it the way it always does when I don't know what to do with the nervous energy that has to go somewhere. My thumb pressing against the worn case. The familiar weight of it. The film was still going. Autumn light from the screen. Reds and golds that matched what had been on the trees along the road out of town. I could hear, from the speaker mounted on the post outside my window, the characters in the movie saying things that had stopped mattering 40 minutes ago when she laughed at something and I stopped watching the screen. The silence after her question was its own kind of answer. I knew that. She knew that. We both sat inside it for a moment that lasted longer than any clock would have accurately measured. Then I said, "No." Just that. One word. The most honest thing I had said in 6 months. And the most frightening. Let me back up. My name is Daniel Voss. I am 39 years old. I live in a town called Barton Falls, Vermont, which has one main street, one diner, one hardware store, and the kind of autumn that makes people who have never lived with real seasons understand for the first time what the word foliage actually means. I have a workshop behind the house where I restore antique clocks and watches, which is not a job most people know exists until they encounter someone who does it. And then they tend to have a lot of questions. I have been doing this work for 17 years. Since I was 22 and stumbled into an apprenticeship under an old Swiss-trained watchmaker in Burlington who needed someone with small hands and patience and found me applying for a job at the hardware store next door. What I do, in the simplest possible terms, is return stopped things to motion. Pocket watches from the 1800s whose mainsprings have fatigued past the point of function. Mantel clocks with worn pivot holes that no longer hold their arbors true. Bracket clocks. Carriage clocks. Long case movements. Wristwatches from the 20s and 30s with cracked jewels and dried lubricants and the particular problem of having been left alone for decades in conditions that were not kind to them. People send them to me, or bring them in wrapped in cloth with the careful reverence people reserve for things they love that have stopped working. And I open them on my bench under the loupe and I read what happened. Watchmaking teaches you a specific relationship with time that is hard to explain to people outside the craft. You work in units that most people do not ordinarily perceive the beat of a balance wheel, typically somewhere between 5 and 10 oscillations per second. The tooth-by-tooth advance of the escape wheel. The accumulation of those tiny increments into something that a face and hands can express in a form a human being can read. You learn that a mechanism this small, this intricate, this dependent on the interaction of components that must be within fractions of a millimeter of their correct positions, is an act of profound optimism. Someone built this decades or centuries ago, believing that all the tiny moving parts would continue to cooperate with each other across years and decades. That the accumulated force of a wound spring could be metered out with enough precision to divide time usefully. And mostly they were right. Mostly the movements survive. They get dirty. They wear. They need attention. But the fundamental architecture holds. The mechanism is still the mechanism. It just needs someone to sit with it long enough to hear what it's asking for. I have lived alone for 6 years. Before that, there was a relationship that lasted 4 years with a woman named Petra who was a veterinarian in Burlington. And before that, there was the general blur of my 30s that I am not inclined to document in detail. Petra and I ended without drama and without bitterness, which sounds like a gentle thing and is, except that the absence of drama also means the absence of a clear story, and without a clear story, you spend longer trying to understand what exactly happened. What I eventually understood was that I had been with Petra in the way that a movement runs in a case that was not made for it, functional, even comfortable in certain lights, but never quite the right fit. The tolerances slightly off. Nothing that would cause a failure you could point to, but enough that everything worked a little harder than it should have had to. I moved to Barton Falls because a client offered me the workshop behind the house at a rent that made the decision easy. And because Burlington had started to feel like a city that was asking me to be more social than I wanted to be. And because Vermont in October is a reason to be anywhere in Vermont in October. I bought the house from the client 2 years after I moved in, when she retired to Sarasota and wanted to be free of the property. I have been here 4 years now. The workshop has the north light that benchwork requires. The town is quiet in the way I needed it to be. I have a routine that fits me with the precision of a movement in its correct case, and I had, before this past spring, made my peace with that precision being the primary thing I was building. Margot Ellison moved into the house next door in April. She arrived on a Saturday when the mud season was finally, reluctantly, giving way to something that could be called spring. The ground still soft. The maples just beginning to show color in a way that was more promise than fact. I was in the workshop when I heard the truck. I did not go out immediately. I am not someone who goes out immediately. But Barton Falls is small enough that you feel the addition of a new person the way a mechanism feels a new component. A slight change in the distribution of weight and attention. And I registered it. I met her the following Monday when she knocked on the workshop door to ask if I knew who owned the property on the other side of her. Because there was a fence issue she wanted to address before it became a disagreement. I told her it was the Hendersons, who were good people, and gave her their number. She thanked me and was about to go, and then she looked past me into the workshop and said, "Are those all clocks?" I said they were mostly watches, with some clocks. She said, "Can I see?" Nobody asks to see. People are politely interested when I explain what I do and then move on to other topics, which is reasonable, because watchmaking is a field with a steep entry cost for the casually curious, but she asked. So I stepped back from the door and let her in. She spent 20 minutes in there. She did not touch anything, which was the correct instinct. But she looked at everything with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who are genuinely interested rather than performing interest. She asked what the loop was for. She asked why one movement was in a tray of solvent. She picked up a mainspring with her eyes before she picked it up with her hands and said, "May I?" which was also the correct instinct. She held it for a moment, the long coiled ribbon of it, and said, "It's like compressed time." I looked at her. She handed the mainspring back. She was a furniture restorer. She had moved to Barton Falls because the cost of a workshop space in Burlington had become unfeasible, and someone had told her about the vacancy next door to me. She worked primarily on antique pieces, chairs and tables and case furniture that came to her damaged or modified or simply worn past the point where their owners knew how to care for them. She stripped them back to what they were. Replaced what couldn't be saved with period-appropriate materials, rebuilt what could be rebuilt, and returned them to function. I recognized in the description a practice that was organized around the same principle as my own work. The principle that the original thing is worth recovering, that the work of understanding what it was is worth doing before deciding what to do with it. I thought about that. I thought about it more than was strictly warranted by a 20-minute conversation with a new neighbor. We became, over the following months, the kind of neighbors who share a fence line and a similar schedule, who are both likely to be in their respective workshops at 7 in the morning and still there at 7 in the evening, who wave across the yard and stop to talk when the talking happens naturally, the way talking happens in small towns where people do not engineer their social lives but simply live them and allow the collisions that come from proximity. She had strong opinions about wood finishing that she was willing to defend at length. I had strong opinions about lubricants that were similarly defensible. We argued about these things without heat and agreed on the more important underlying question, which was that the material integrity of old things mattered and was worth fighting for. She made me laugh, which is not something I say lightly. I am not a person for whom laughter comes easily or frequently. Not because I lack humor, but because my humor tends to live in a register that not everyone can hear. She heard it. She heard the dry things I said that were not labeled as jokes and responded to them accordingly, which produced in me the particular pleasure of being understood without effort, without translation, without the slightly exhausting work of making yourself legible to someone whose frequency is different from your own. I noticed all of this. I noticed it carefully, and I stored it in the part of my mind that keeps observations without yet assigning them meaning. The watchmaker's habit of cataloging what is present before drawing conclusions about what it indicates. I was aware that I was doing this. I was also aware that the catalog was growing longer than could easily be dismissed as neutral observation. Here is the thing I knew about myself that made me careful. 6 years of living alone is not nothing. It is not a wound, and it is not a deficit. But it is a fact that reshapes you. The way a movement that has run unwound for years develops a specific set of characteristics around the absence of tension. The mainspring is still there. The mechanism is still capable, but everything has settled into a configuration that accommodates the stillness. And returning the tension requires adjustment, requires the recalibration of components that have found their equilibrium in a state that no longer includes the force that once drove them. I had adjusted to my own stillness. My days were precise and full and organized around work that I loved and a quiet that I had come to need. I was not unhappy. I was not lonely in any way that felt like loss. I was running correctly for the configuration I had arrived at, and there was a real satisfaction in that, in the efficiency of a life that had been calibrated to fit exactly what it was, what Margot did, without intending to. Without any action more dramatic than showing up next door and asking to see the workshop, was introduce a force into the mechanism that the mechanism was not currently configured to handle. Not a damaging force. Not an incompatible component. The right kind of force, correctly applied. The kind that should theoretically get a stopped movement running again. Which was the problem. Because getting a stopped movement running again means it is no longer stopped. Means it is moving. Means it requires ongoing attention and care and the management of all the tiny tolerances that a running movement demands and a stopped one does not. I was afraid of the running. That is the truth of it. As precisely as I can state it. Not afraid of her. Not afraid of failure. Afraid of the running itself. Of what it would mean to be back in motion. Of the particular vulnerability of a movement that is trying to function correctly. That is exposed to all the things that can go wrong when you are no longer protected by your own stillness. I named what we were doing just friends in my own mind in June. When it became clear that we were doing something and it required a name, I did not say this out loud. I simply assigned the label and used it as a weight to keep things from floating upward into territory I had not decided to enter. We had dinner occasionally. We walked the trail along the river that runs through the edge of town. She came to the workshop to look at movements I was finding particularly interesting. I went to her studio to look at pieces she was rebuilding. All of this was the activity of two people who enjoyed each other's company, which is a thing that exists and is real and does not necessarily imply anything beyond itself. I told myself this with the conviction of a person who knows he is not being entirely honest and is choosing to continue anyway. Because the alternative requires a courage he is not sure he has assembled yet. The summer passed in this configuration. I watched her work through her studio window when I was in the yard. I registered the way she talked about the furniture she was restoring, the specific tenderness she brought to descriptions of original surfaces and period joinery and the evidence of previous owners' lives left in the wood. I registered the way she stood in a room, settled into her own presence without needing to perform it. I registered the way she listened, fully, without the ambient distraction of someone waiting for their turn to speak. I registered all of it. I did not know what to do with any of it. In August, she mentioned the drive-in, the Lakeview Cinema, 15 miles outside of Barton Falls on a road that follows the edge of a reservoir, running its last season before the owners retired and sold the property to developers who would do with it whatever developers did with flat land in Vermont. She said she'd seen it on a drive and thought it looked like the kind of thing that existed only in a specific window of time and season, and she wanted to go before the window closed. She said this to me on a Tuesday evening when we were both in the yard at the same time. The light going long and golden the way Vermont light goes in August when summer is already beginning to acknowledge that it is not permanent. I said I'd like to go too. She said, "This weekend." Then, I said, "This weekend." I spent the rest of the week performing, for my own benefit. The maintenance of the label. Just friends going to a drive-in. People do this. Neighbors do this. There is nothing in the activity of two people watching a film in a parking lot that requires it to be anything more than what it appears to be on the surface. And I was committed to the surface. I was the primary engineer of the surface, and I had good reasons for this engineering, and I believed in them. The problem with the watchmaker's habit of careful observation is that it does not turn off when you would prefer it to. On Saturday she drove, because my truck's heat was unreliable, and October nights in Vermont require reliable heat. She arrived at my door at 7, having resolved the question of what to wear in the way she resolved most questions. Directly and without apparent anxiety, a red sweater and her work jacket, the canvas one with the collar she turned up against the cold, and her hair loose in the way she wore it when she was not working, when her hands were free to do something other than hold tools. We drove the 15 miles to the Lakeview with the particular ease of two people who had accumulated enough conversation over 6 months that silence between them was also comfortable. Also, a form of communication. Also something that did not require management. The reservoir was dark on one side of the road, and the maple trees were doing their Vermont October thing on the other. The yellows and reds and oranges so saturated in the last light that they looked produced rather than natural, painted rather than grown. She said, at some point on the drive, "I'm going to miss this when the season ends." I said, "The drive-in." She said, "The light, the way everything looks right now." I said, "It comes back." She said, "It does." She said it in the way of someone who knows something to be true and is choosing to find comfort in the knowing rather than sorrow in the temporary absence. The Lakeview was smaller than I expected, which is to say, it was the right size for what it was. A single screen and a concession stand and rows of speaker posts and enough space for perhaps 80 cars. And on a Saturday in October with 2 weeks left in its existence, it was mostly full. We found a spot toward the center. The speaker crackled when I rolled down my window and hooked it over the glass. The film was a comedy, which she had chosen and I had agreed to without reservation because the film was not the point and I had understood this. In some part of myself I was not yet fully acknowledging, since she first mentioned the drive-in in August. The early part of the film was easy. We ate the popcorn she had gotten from the concession stand. The good kind, with real butter. And the comedy did what a good comedy does, which is to produce laughter without requiring you to think about whether you are laughing. The laugh arriving before the self-consciousness can intercept it. She laughed easily, the way people laugh who have not trained themselves out of it. And I laughed with her. And the evening had the specific texture of something good that was happening and needed only to be inhabited without examination. Then, there was a scene, about 40 minutes in, where a minor character said something in the background that was probably not meant to be the funniest thing in the scene, but landed with a precision that I recognized. The timing of it, the specificity, and she caught it too and laughed. The real version. The full version, unguarded, her head tilting back slightly the way it did when something got past all her editing, and I did not look at the screen. I looked at her. Not a long look, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, but she was still looking at the screen, and then the laugh was settling, fading into the afterglow of a real laugh. And I saw, in the last half-second of it, her attention shift, not to me. She didn't turn. but the quality of her awareness changed. And I understood that she had felt the 2 seconds of my attention the way you feel a change in pressure, without looking at the source. The laugh finished. She looked at the screen. I looked at the screen. We both pretended, for the next 30 minutes, to be watching a movie. The watch was in my coat pocket. I had put it there that morning the way I always did. The unconscious preparation of someone who carries a talisman without entirely admitting that it is one. It was a Waltham pocket watch from 1892, gold-filled case with the engine turning worn down to a smoothness on the back where a century of hands had held it. The movement inside was the first movement I ever successfully restored. When I was 22 and learning, and the watchmaker I was apprenticed to handed it to me as the first solo project and said nothing about what it would. I mean if I got it right, and nothing about what it would mean if I got it wrong. And I took it home and spent 3 nights on it and got it right. The watch ran 3 minutes fast per day. I had never corrected this. Every movement has an error rate, a systematic deviation from perfect timekeeping that is the signature of the specific mechanism, the sum of all its physical characteristics. 3 minutes fast was this watch's character. I had known for 17 years how to correct it and had never done so. I kept the watch and I kept the 3 minutes and I called the deviation evidence of character rather than a flaw to be addressed. And this was honest and also, I understood now, a decision I had made because correcting it would have meant interfering with the first thing I had ever truly fixed. And I did not want to be the person who improved on the first right thing. My thumb found it in my pocket. I pressed against the case. The film continued. And then she said it. Is that really what we are? She said it without preamble, without connection to anything that had just happened in the film or in the conversation we were not having. She said it in the way of someone releasing a weight they have been holding long enough to know exactly how much it weighs. The silence. I have thought about that silence. I have thought about what it must have been like to ask a question like that and then sit in the silence that followed it, not knowing yet whether the silence meant yes. We are just friends. You have misread everything. Or whether it meant something else. She sat in it without flinching. She kept looking straight ahead. That took more courage than the question did. I think the question was something she had been building toward. The silence was something she had to withstand without preparation. I said, "No." One word. The weight of it leaving my chest in a way that felt like a mainspring releasing tension it had held past the point of comfort. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." Not a dramatic, "okay." Not a relieved "okay." Though I thought relief was in it somewhere. Just the specific "okay" of a person receiving information they had been waiting for and integrating it into what they already knew. I said, "I've been telling myself we were." She said, "I know, I could tell." I said, "Was it obvious?" She said, "Not to anyone else. You were very consistent about it. But I know the difference between someone who is comfortable with me and someone who is working hard to stay in a particular place." I said, "How long have you known?" She paused. She said, "Since June, probably. Since that afternoon you came to look at the Windsor chair and spent 20 minutes explaining the mechanics of the balance wheel to me when I hadn't asked. You do that when something else is happening in your head. I thought about that. I thought about the Windsor chair afternoon, which I remembered clearly, the particular carved splat of it. The replaced stretchers that she'd matched so well I had to look twice to see the joins. I had talked about balance wheels. I did not remember talking about balance wheels, but I believed her, because the mechanism I had been describing that afternoon was precisely the thing I could not talk about directly. I said, "I'm sorry it took this long." She said, "What was the part that was hard?" The film was still going. Behind us, 3 rows back, someone's children were asleep in the back seat in the way children fall asleep at drive-ins, instantaneously and completely. The Vermont night had gone fully cold, the kind of cold that is serious about itself. The air carrying the specific compound of fallen leaves and cold water and the coming winter. The maples along the road were invisible now in the dark, but I knew they were there, holding their colors in the absence of light. I said, I knew what I was doing. With the watch, when something comes in that I know how to fix, there's no fear in opening it up. I've done it 1,000 times. I know the movements. I know the risks. I know what can go wrong and how to manage it. But the first time I restored something, I was afraid to open the case. Not because I didn't know what to do, because I knew what it would mean if I got it right. It would mean I was someone who could do this. And then I'd have to keep being that person. She was quiet for a moment. She said, You got it right, though. I said, I did. She said, Is that the watch in your pocket, the one you always have? I said, The same movement. Yes. 1892 Waltham. The first one I ever finished. She said, Does it keep good time? I said, 3 minutes fast per day. I've never corrected it. She said, Why not? I said, Because correcting it would mean deciding that the deviation matters more than what it is. She was quiet for a long moment. The film reached its ending. The particular satisfying resolution of a well-made comedy. And the credits began to roll. And the lot started the slow process of dispersing. She didn't start the car. We sat while the cars around us filed out in their patient single-file procession, the red of taillights moving through the dark of the lot, and the speaker crackled with the end of the film's score and then fell to static. She said, I'm not going to be a project for you. I said, I know. She said, I mean it. I'm not a movement that stopped and needs someone to figure out what went wrong. I said, That's not what this is. She said, What is it then? I thought about how to say it accurately. I said, When a movement comes in that I've been thinking about for a long time, that I've been looking forward to working on. Sometimes I stand at the bench for a while before I open the case, not because I'm afraid it will be too hard, because I know it's going to be interesting, and I want to be fully present for it. I want to be in the right state of mind before I start. She said, And you're in the right state of mind now. I said, I think I've been arriving at it since April. She smiled. I could see it in the light from the speaker post. The small exterior lamp still lit, even with the film ended. The particular soft light of a drive-in lot at the end of an evening. She said, 6 months is a long approach. I said, I'm precise. It takes the time it takes. She said, I've noticed. We sat for another few minutes while the last cars trickled out and the Lakeview's crew began their end-of-night rounds. Then she said, 2 weeks left in the season. Do you want to come back next week? I said, Yes. She said, Not as just friends. I said, Not as just friends. She started the car. On the drive back, the road was dark except for the headlights and the occasional lit window of a farmhouse set back in the trees. And the maples were shapes against the sky rather than colors. Their October extravagance hidden by the dark and waiting for morning to be visible again. She drove the way she did most things, without unnecessary motion, with the ease of someone who has learned to be competent without performing competence. I had the watch in my hand. I had taken it out of my pocket at some point during the drive without noticing. The same reflex. The same, reaching for the familiar weight when something significant was happening and my hands needed something to do with the energy of it. I was holding it in my palm. The smooth case. The weight of it. The particular warmth that the metal takes from the skin of the person who carries it. She glanced at it once. Then, at the road. I said, I want to tell you something about this watch. She said, Tell me. I said, I've carried it for 17 years. Every day. It runs 3 minutes fast and I've never corrected it because it was the first thing I ever got right and I didn't want to change anything about it. I was afraid that if I touched it again I'd break whatever made it right. She said, And I said, I've been doing the same thing to myself, keeping things exactly as they've been because the configuration works. Because I got myself to a place that ran correctly and I didn't want to introduce anything that might disrupt it. Even something good. Even something that was worth disrupting it for. she said. And, I said, and I've been wrong about that. A movement that never gets serviced doesn't stay running forever just because it's running now. Everything needs attention eventually. Everything benefits from someone who knows what they're doing, deciding to open the case. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me to service you?" I said. That came out more mechanically than I intended. She laughed. The real version, full, and I felt the sound of it the way I felt the watch in my palm, the specific weight of something real. She said, "I know what you mean." I said, "I know you do." We pulled into Barton Falls on the main street. Empty, at this hour. The diner dark. The hardware store dark. The few streetlights making halos in the cold air. She pulled up to my house and parked. We sat for a moment in the engine warm of the car, the cold pressing against the windows from outside, the particular intimacy of a small, enclosed space on a cold night. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the watch. I held it for a moment. Then I reached over and put it in the outer pocket of her canvas jacket. The one with the collar she wore turned up. I did not explain the gesture. I put the watch in her pocket and she looked down at the pocket and then at me, and she did not ask what it meant, which was how I knew she already knew. She said, "I'll take good care of it." I said, "I know." I got out of the car. She stayed in the car for a moment, which I could tell because I heard the engine running still when I was on the porch. Then she turned it off and went inside. I stood on the porch in the cold for a few minutes. The maples along the street were shapes in the dark, the same shapes they would be in winter without their leaves, already beginning their withdrawal from color toward the long simplicity of the cold months. I had lived through 4 Vermont winters in this house. I knew what they asked of you, the specific patience of a landscape that went spare and gray and required you to hold in memory the fact of spring without being able to see any evidence of it. It was a good preparation for certain things. The practice of trusting what you know is there even when you cannot currently see it. I went inside. I sat at the workbench. Not to work, just to be in the room that was most fully mine, surrounded by the trays and tools and the movements in various states of disassembly, the particular quiet of a workshop after the day's work is done. On the bench in front of me was a carriage clock that had come in last week. Its case open, the movement extracted. The problem, a worn gathering pallet that would need to be fabricated from scratch because no replacement part existed for a movement this old. The work of it would take patience and precision and the willingness to spend time with a small problem until it yielded to understanding. I was good at this. I had always been good at this. What I had not been good at. For a long time, he was applying the same patience to things outside the workshop. The same willingness to sit with a problem until it became clear. The same trust that if you worked carefully and honestly, the mechanism would tell you what it needed. Margot had sat with me for 6 months. She had not rushed the mechanism. She had been present and consistent, and she had asked the question when the question was ready to be asked. Not before. Not after. With the precision of someone who understood, in her own craft, the importance of timing. You do not rush a joint before the glue has set. You do not rush a question before the other person has arrived at the answer. She had given me the time to arrive. I sat at the bench for an hour. Not working, just thinking in the presence of the work, which is a different kind of thinking. Quieter and more productive in its way than the thinking you do when you are sitting with nothing in your hands. The carriage clock waited with the patience of things that have already waited a long time and know how to do it. I thought about the watch in her pocket. The Waltham, 1892. The first movement I had ever gotten right. I thought about what it meant to give it to her. Not as a dramatic gesture. Not as a declaration of anything formal, but as the thing it actually was, which was, this is the first right thing I ever did. I am putting it with you. That means something about what I trust you with. I thought about her saying I'll take good care of it. She would. She was someone who took good care of things, who understood the value of what had survived and the responsibility that came with tending it. Her whole practice was built on that understanding. She did not restore furniture to make it new. She restored it to make it fully what it was, to remove what had accumulated over it and return it to the integrity of its original design, the thing it had been made to be. I thought, for the first time without the anxiety that usually accompanied the thought, about what it might mean to be tended that way, to be known by someone who understood the value of original material, who did not want to renovate but to restore, who would sit with the mechanism long enough to understand it before deciding anything about what it needed. That was not a small thing to have found next door. The following Saturday I knocked on her workshop door at 10 in the morning. The hour I had learned she was usually between tasks, the movement in one hand and the small case of tools I had brought because she had asked once to see what a full service actually looked like up close. She opened the door and looked at the movement in my hand and said, "Is that the Waltham?" I said it was. She said, "You're going to correct it." I said, "I'm going to service it first. Then I'm going to regulate it." She stepped back from the door. I came in. Her workshop smelled of wood and linseed oil and the specific dusty warmth of old furniture, and in the center of it was a Queen Anne side table she had been working on for 2 weeks. Its surface stripped back to bare wood, the original walnut coming through under the layers of later stains and coatings, grain and figure that had been invisible for decades, now visible again in the morning light. I looked at it the way I always looked at the things she was restoring, with the recognition of a person who understood the work that had gone into making the invisible visible again. I set the movement down on her bench. Next to the tools she had cleared a space for, she pulled a stool over and sat beside me, close enough to see but not in my way. The configuration of someone who had been in workshops their whole life and knew the etiquette of them. I said, 3 minutes fast is a bent regulator pin. Probably always was. Whoever made this movement set it up slightly off, and no one caught it because the error was small enough to live with. She said, "But you could fix it." I said, "I should have fixed it 17 years ago. I was keeping it wrong because the wrong version was the one I knew." She said, "That's very human." I said, "It's also bad watchmaking." She said, "Those aren't mutually exclusive." I worked for an hour while she watched and occasionally asked questions. The good questions. The ones that came from genuine curiosity about what was happening rather than from the need to fill silence. I cleaned the movement with the care it deserved. A century-old mechanism that had earned the right to be handled well. I replaced the dried lubricants with fresh ones. I checked the jewels, inspected the mainspring, verified the function of each wheel and pinion in the gear train. The movement was sound. The movement had always been sound. It needed cleaning and lubricant and the correction of one small error that had propagated across 17 years because the person responsible for it had decided that the error was tolerable. I adjusted the regulator. I wound the movement and watched the balance wheels swing to life. The familiar oscillation, 5 beats per second. The ancient rhythm of a mechanism returning to its purpose. I timed it against my reference clock. Within 30 seconds it was clear the rate had changed. She said, "Is it right now?" I said, "It will need a few days to settle. Then I'll check it and adjust again if necessary. Regulation is iterative. You get it close, and then you let it run, and you see what it does." She said, "That's also very human." I said, "Yes." I looked at her. She was looking at the movement, at the balance wheel, swinging in its small, precise arc, the accumulated force of the mainspring being metered out beat by beat into something that could be used. She had the expression she wore when she was thinking about something carefully, the particular interior quality of it, the signs I had learned to read over the course of a spring and summer and fall. I said, "Thank you for asking." She said, "At the drive-in." I said, "Yes." She said, "You would have gotten there." I said, "Maybe. But it would have taken longer. And I've used enough time already." She looked at me then. The direct version. The version I had been receiving in increasing frequency since October. She said, "The watch is still in my jacket pocket." I said, "I know. Keep it for a while," she said. "It'll run 3 minutes fast." I said, "Not anymore." She smiled. Not the full laugh. Not the one that tilted her head back. But the one that was quieter and more specific. The one that was for things that were true rather than things that were funny. The two categories sometimes overlapping but not identical, and I had learned to tell the difference. Outside her workshop window, the maples were holding their last colors. The peak of October in Vermont. The days when everything decides to be as fully itself as it is ever going to be before the cold asks it to let go. I had 4 years of this view. 4 years of this specific extravagance. And it still required nothing of me but presence. Just the willingness to be there and to look. I had not been very good at presence for a long time. I had been good at precision. Good at patience. Good at the focused application of skill to mechanisms that required careful handling. But presence is different from precision. Presence means being available to what is actually happening rather than to the controlled environment of the workbench, where you set the terms and everything else is variable to be managed. I was learning it again. It was iterative. I would get it close and then let it run and see what it did. The movement was in its case. The case was in my hands. I turned it over once. The warm gold-filled metal. The engine turning on the front, still legible. The back worn smooth by the decades of hands that had held it before me and the 17 years of my own hand after them. The crystal was slightly scratched. I should replace the crystal. I had been meaning to replace the crystal for years and had not done it. Another small correction deferred. Another decision to let the imperfect version be the version I lived with. I was going to replace the crystal. I was going to do that. And regulate the movement properly. And let the watch be what it was capable of being, rather than the preserved artifact of the first right thing. The monument to a beginning that had calcified into an end point. It had been a beginning. It was still a beginning. Beginnings did not stop being beginnings because time had passed over them. They waited, under whatever had accumulated, for the person who was ready to clear the surface and see what was underneath. I put the watch on her bench, next to the tools. I would come back for it in a few days, when the regulation had settled, when I could verify the rate. She was looking at the Queen Anne table, at the walnut grain coming through in the light. She said, "I've been thinking about what finish to use. I want it to be close to the original, but I can't know exactly what the original was." I said, "What does the wood tell you?" She said, "That it wants something that lets it breathe. Something that doesn't sit on top but goes in." I said, "Then trust that." She said, "It might be wrong." I said, "It might, but it's what the material is asking for." She looked at me, and the look held for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the exchange of information. And then she turned back to the table and said, "I'll try it." I said, "Let me know how it goes." She said, "I will." I picked up my tool case. I left the watch on her bench and went back to my own workshop, to the carriage clock and the gathering pallet that needed to be fabricated from scratch. The problem that would take patience and precision and the willingness to work with a small error until it yielded. Outside the workshop window, the maples continued their brief and extravagant display, all the color they had been building toward all summer, now available for anyone who stood still long enough to see it. The whole gorgeous argument for presence, for being there when the light was right and the timing was correct and the mechanism was finally, after all the careful work, running true. 3 weeks after the drive-in, on a Tuesday morning when the last of the maple color had finally conceded to the gray of November, I was at the bench, regulating a pocket watch that had come in from an estate sale in Burlington. A simple lever movement from the 1930s that had been overwound at some point in its history and had bent a tooth on the escape wheel. Standard work. The kind of repair that does not require thinking, only attention, and so allows the mind to move through other rooms while the hands do their job. I was thinking about regulation. The technical kind. The process of adjusting a timepiece's rate until it runs correctly, but also the other kind. the one that does not have a technical name. The adjustment you make to your own mechanism after a long period of running in a configuration that was correct for what it was, but is no longer what it needs to be. You do not reset a watch all at once. You make a small correction and you let it run, and you observe the result and you make another small correction and you let it run again. Iteration. Patience. The willingness to make a tentative adjustment and live with its results before deciding what to do next. Margot had come by the previous evening with the Waltham. She had kept it for 2 weeks in the pocket of the canvas jacket, and she brought it back with the care of someone returning a borrowed thing, setting it on the bench in front of me with 2 hands rather than 1, which was the watchmaker's instinct, the correct instinct, and I thought she has been paying attention longer than I realized, to more things than I realized. I had timed it. The rate was within 15 seconds per day of correct, which for an 1892 pocket movement in its current state of service was better than I had hoped. I told her this and she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, it meant the regulation was holding. The correction was closer to right than wrong. And she said, "Good." In the specific way, she said things that she meant to carry further than the immediate statement. I had put the watch in my pocket, the familiar weight of it, the smooth case, the warmth it took from my skin, the same watch, the same movement, but corrected now, running within a range that was honest rather than persistently, willfully, wrong. 3 minutes had been its error for 17 years. The error was gone. The watch was the same watch. The movement was the same movement. The correction had not changed what it was. It had allowed it to be more fully what it was, freed from a systematic deviation that had nothing to do with its nature and everything to do with a moment of imprecision that nobody had gotten around to addressing. I thought about what Margot had said on the drive home from the Lakeview. After the not just friends conversation had settled into something real, and the silence between us had become the comfortable kind again. She had said, while they were driving through the dark stretch of road between the reservoir and town, "I need to tell you something." I had said, "Tell me." She had said, "I asked about the drive-in in August because I wanted to go somewhere specific with you. Not just somewhere, that specific place. Because it closes at the end of the season and once it closes, it's gone. And I have been in the habit of not going to things that close before I get to them. I didn't want to do that again." I had sat with that for a moment. I said, "What was the last thing you didn't get to?" She said, "A lot of things. Some of them furniture. Some of them not. I'm trying to get better at acting on the right things before the window closes." I said, "The Lakeview closes in 2 weeks." She said, "We went." I said, "We did." She said, "What was the last thing you didn't get to?" I thought about this honestly. I said, "Probably some of the same things. I've been good at deciding that the configuration I have is enough and that adding anything to it is unnecessary risk." She said, "And," I said, "and I think I've been wrong about what constitutes risk. The thing I've been treating as safe is also a form of risk. Just a quieter one." She had driven for a moment in silence and then said, "Precisely," in the tone of a person who has been waiting for a specific word and has now heard it. At the bench, the lever movement was yielding to the repair. The bent tooth was straightened. The escape wheel running clean. The rate settling as I adjusted. I worked through it with the patience it required and thought about quiet risk. The risk of stillness. The risk of a configuration that runs correctly, but at the cost of everything that would require it to run differently. I had been managing that risk for 6 years. I had been so careful about it that I had failed to notice when it stopped being management and started being the thing itself, when the protection had become the enclosure, when the decision not to let anything disrupt the mechanism had become its own form of disruption. The disruption of everything I might have been doing instead. The carriage clock was still on the bench. The gathering pallet problem still waiting. I had fabricated the part the previous week, filing and fitting it to the movement with the patience the work required. And now it needed only the final adjustment before I could call the repair complete. I would finish it today. Then I would write up the documentation and contact the client, and the clock would go back to the family that had sent it. And it would run for another generation or more if it was cared for. Which it would be, because the family had been keeping it for 4 generations already and knew what that required. This is what I came back to. In the end, when I thought about the 6 years and the configuration and what it had cost and what it had preserved, the mechanism had survived. The original capacity was intact. I had kept myself in a state of preservation, clean and dry and protected from the conditions that caused damage. And the result was that when the right person came along and knocked on the workshop door and wanted to see, there was something worth showing. The movement was sound. The jewels were intact. The gear train was correct. There was one systematic error in the rate. A bent regulator pin. A small imprecision that I had been carrying for years because I did not want to touch what was already working. But that was correctable. That had always been correctable. The correction held. Margot was in her workshop next door. I could hear, occasionally, the sounds of her working, the scrape of a card scraper on wood, the low sound of her talking to herself in the way she did when she was working through a problem, running through her options out loud in the voice she used when the audience was just herself and the piece she was restoring. I had learned to distinguish this from the sound of her on the phone. From the sound of her at the radio she kept on low for company in the long stretches of solitary work. I had been learning the sounds of her workshop for 7 months and knew them the way you learn the sounds of a mechanism. By attentive listening over time, the specific vocabulary of a running thing. That evening she would come over, or I would go over, the way we had been doing since October. The arrangements made with the ease of people who have stopped needing to negotiate them formally. We would eat something, and talk, and I would tell her about the carriage clock and she would tell me about the Queen Anne table, and the conversation would move the way it always moved, into the spaces between the technical things, into the territory where the work was the way in to talking about the other things. And the other things turned out to be not so different from the work after all. She had said, "On the drive home from the Lakeview I'm not going to be easy." I had said, "I know." She had said, I'm going to have opinions. Loud ones. Sometimes. About your workshop and about the town council's decisions about the historic district and about the correct approach to finishing antique walnut, and you're not going to agree with all of them." I had said, "Good." She had looked at me. I had said, "A movement that never encounters any resistance runs too fast. The escapement is resistance. The escapement is what makes it keep correct time instead of just burning through the mainspring all at once. I need the resistance. It's what the mechanism is built for." She had said, "Did you just compare me to an escapement?" I had said, "It was a compliment." She had laughed. The full version, head tilting back, the laugh she did not edit. And I had sat in the passenger seat of her car on a dark Vermont road in October and felt the mechanism in my chest do the thing it had been refusing to do for a long time, which is run with the kind of energy that requires something to push against, the kind of energy that is not sustainable in perfect stillness, the kind that needs the check of a well-made escapement to keep it from becoming merely momentum. The Waltham was in my pocket, running correctly now, or as correctly as a century-old mechanism can run after one service and one careful regulation, which is not perfectly, which is with the particular character of an old thing that has been through a great deal and bears the marks of it and runs within an acceptable range of honest. 3 weeks into November, the maples were bare. The workshops were warm. The work continued. On the bench and next door in the furniture studio. The patient work of 2 people who understood what it meant to sit with something until you saw what it needed, and to trust what you saw when you saw it. The clock, on the bench, ticked. Outside the window, the bare maple branches held the gray November sky in their pattern, the structure of the tree visible now that the leaves were gone, the actual architecture of it, the way it had organized itself over years to put the most surface area in the best light. And I thought you cannot see this in October. October is too full of color to show you the bones. November is when you see what was always holding everything up. It was a good time to be looking. I finished the carriage clock that afternoon, wound it, set it on the bench and listened to the tick, the specific voice of a movement that has been restored to its correct function. Every component cooperating with every other component at the tolerances they were built to maintain. A good sound. The sound of something working the way it was meant to work. I wrapped it carefully and wrote up the documentation and set it by the door for shipping in the morning. Then I cleaned the bench and put away the tools and stood for a moment in the workshop in the particular quiet of the end of a day's work. The light going out the window. The clocks on the shelf behind me keeping their various times, each one with its own rate, its own systematic deviation from perfect, its own character expressed in how it chose to be wrong within acceptable margins. Every clock is wrong in its own way. The perfect timekeeper does not exist and never has, and the pursuit of it is both the discipline and the humility of the craft. The understanding that you are always working toward something you will not quite reach, that close enough is the standard you are actually aiming for, that the margin of acceptable error is not a failure of the ideal, but the honest acknowledgement that mechanisms have character, and character is not something you eliminate. I put on my coat, the Waltham settled into my pocket. I locked the workshop and went to knock on Margot's door. She answered before I finished knocking, which she did more often now, and she was wearing an apron still. The work apron, which meant she had been at the bench until this moment. And she had a small smear of Danish oil on her left forearm that she had not noticed. I noticed it and did not say anything about it. In the way I did not say anything about the specific things I noticed that did not need to be commented on to be received. She said, "The clock." I said, "Finished, running well." She said, "Come in." Then I went in. The Queen Anne table was against the wall with the finish drying. The walnut coming through in a way that was, I could see even across the room, exactly what she had said she was aiming for. Not sitting on the surface. Going in. The wood itself. Visible. Breathing. The finish so perfectly suited to the material that it looked like the wood had simply decided, after all these years, to reveal its full quality. I stood in front of it for a moment without saying anything. Then I said, "That's right." She said, "Yes, no pretense." Just the specific satisfaction of a person who has done the thing they set out to do. I stayed 3 hours. We ate dinner and argued, mildly and productively, about the town council vote and about whether a certain approach to pivot polishing was still defensible given the available alternatives. And the argument was comfortable. The way arguments are comfortable. When you trust the person you are arguing with, to be honest, and to be listening even while they are disagreeing. She was right about the pivot polishing. I conceded this. She did not make anything of the concession because she did not need to. When I left, she walked me to the door and handed me something. The Waltham. She had taken it from my coat pocket at some point during the evening without my noticing, which was a thing she could do because she had good hands and good instincts about when a person was not paying attention to their pockets. She set it in my palm. She said, "Keep it running." I said, "I intend to." She said, "Good night." I walked back to my house in the cold, the watch in my hand, the Vermont November doing what Vermont November does, which is remind you clearly and without apology that warmth is not a given and must be found and kept and maintained against the ambient cold, actively and with intention, because it will not sustain itself. Good information, the kind that is useful specifically because it is uncomfortable. I went inside. I wound the watch. I set it on the workbench where I could hear it through the night if the workshop was quiet enough. The tick of it, the small regular voice of a mechanism running correctly, keeping time as honestly as a century-old movement can keep it, which is not perfectly, which is within the margins of its own particular character, which was enough. It had always been enough,